Welcome, everybody, to the Healing Place podcast. I am your host, Teri Wellbrock. Excited to have with me today, Janyne McConnaughey. No relation to Matthew.
He's actually missing an N.
Right. Yes. I know we talked about it. I made sure to pronounce your name right. So I'm going to switch over here for just a second, and I'm going to read your bio because I love it. Your mission statement. It's your mission statement. So it is to articulate both positive and negative effects of early nurturing and experiences on lifelong behavior and thinking patterns while promoting effective educational, spiritual, and therapeutic methods for the healing of inadequate attachment and childhood trauma. Amen.
That's it.
That's wonderful. So bottom line is, childhood trauma, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because attachment before the trauma, it all ties in together. It's all mixed together.
Right. Well, welcome. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
I'm glad to be here.
So you wrote a book entitled Brave, and it's a personal story of healing childhood trauma, which is exactly what we were just talking about. So talk to us about Brave and what inspired you, what moved you to write it.
Well, I think I have to begin with my story of how I got to Brave. And so I had completed almost a 40-year career in education, 33 years in higher education. I was a teacher educator. And so that is what I spent most of my life doing, is preparing teachers for the classroom. And I had always known that I had issues with depression, that there were times in my life I was so completely, that I always said that I was living above something. I never knew what it was, but I always said I was living above something. And my final year of teaching, I knew it was getting worse. In fact, I had to request that I do completely online teaching because I was starting to have problems in the classroom and so forth. And so I ended up going to therapy, and that turned my world upside down, because within a few sessions, it was clear that something had happened to me, something terrible had happened to me as a child, and that I was living my life with dissociative coping mechanisms. And that whatever had happened to me, which took us some time to get to, had fractured. It occurred before the sense of self was established. And it had fractured me into pieces, and as abuse continued. And I want to say that I had this perfect story about my childhood, because my dad was a preacher, my mom, and he was my hero. I just want to say that right up front, because it's always, oh, was it your dad? No, it was never my dad. My mother suffered from something, and had mental health issues my life. And so, but I grew up in the 1950s, 1960s. I had a great church family. I was a good student. No one ever suspected. And it was my determination to be normal. I didn't want anyone to know that there was something. Well, there wasn't something wrong with me. Something bad happened to me. So anyway, back to therapy. I show up to therapy with this wonderful story, and within 5 sessions. And the therapist used EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, saved my life. But in the midst of one of those EMDR therapy sessions, she asked me to come back to my adult self. And I said, which one?
Oh.
Yeah.
Yes.
And she was always very calm. She said, there's more than one? And I said, oh yes, there's 3 adults. And I can go home and I can describe them for you, and I'll come back with descriptions. And we were off to the races. And so, so Brave, the book I wrote, it began with as my processing I'm a writer. And so the way to healing for me was to write and write and write. And I had this amazingly dedicated therapist who read everything that I wrote for 3 solid years, and used it to help us with the therapy process. But in the midst of that, it created a book.
Wow.
And so Brave is actually my 3-year intensive therapy journey. So it's my story, but it's really everything that I learned about trauma and attachment and repression, because I had repressed everything. And I had pieces of it. That's a really interesting part, was I knew exactly what happened in a situation up to the point where I was abused. I was standing at a gate. I was walking into a room. I remembered pieces of it. And so when we got to the memory, I'm like, oh, I realized that I was like a little girl with a superhuman cape on me, you know, and I would just create a different story. No, that isn't what I want that to end like. I'm just going to create a different story about it. And so all the memories were there, but not the central core of the abuse. So Brave is really my journey of learning who I was and what happened to me.
Wow, beautiful. I mean, beautiful. I say beautiful, but only because what a journey and what a gift it was. I too did EMDR. I did 4 years, 98 sessions. And it was during EMDR for the first time that my therapist said the word, you know, you coped with dissociation. And I was like, what do you mean? I don't even know what that is. What are you talking about? So, yeah.
You don't know, right?
Right. Yeah. I remember her telling me, you know, and I equated it to remember the Dewey Decimal System at the library and the little drawers, you know, you'd pull them out and you'd have to flip through the cards and find your book and go find it on the shelf. And I compartmentalized all of my traumas, which there were many of, into these little drawers. And so that's how my little superpower was to just store them in a little box and then put them away on the shelf. And then the next one, store it in its own little box instead of letting them compile on top of each other. That's how I coped. And then the other thing was, this is the dissociation part, was I would see things as if I was watching a movie, as if I was watching something happen to another little girl. Because like watching, like you said, when you said that about, you know, like up above, I would be standing in the room watching it happen. And I knew a powerful moment of healing for me was, I was involved in 2 bank robberies when I was 21 and 22 by the same assailants, and a coworker was murdered. And so we had gone back to the second robbery, and I just remember like closing my eyes for a second and being like, oh, wow. And my therapist was like, what? And I said, I'm seeing, and I was turning my head and I said, I'm seeing this from within my own body. And it was the first time we had returned to a memory, and I was back in my own body, and that was crazy. Like I was no longer watching a movie.
Yes.
Yeah.
And to get our memories back and to own them.
Yeah.
And to us.
That's really, well, that's
the first time that I realized that I was floating, that I was watching, was really not even a super traumatic. My brother was 10 years older than I was. He was my hero. He's still my hero. But he got married when I was in the 5th grade. And my whole life I told this story that I was so upset about him getting married that I didn't go sit with the family. I went and sat in the balcony and watched the wedding.
Oh.
And one day in therapy, I felt myself walking in and sitting in the pew right at the wedding, and my parents were all lined up next to me, and I thought, wait, I wasn't. And I wrote my brother, I said, did the church have a balcony? And he was like, no, the church does not have a balcony. And that was when I began to realize that when I thought I was hovering over something, that it was dissociation. And so kind of an odd way for me to make that realization. And then I began to realize that I blocked the core memory and went on with my stories that weren't, that wasn't that they weren't true, I guess. There was just something missing, and I escaped. I always said,
Right.
There was one where I was raped as a freshman in college, and which I want to say that those girls who experience childhood abuse, the statistic is like 60% of them will be raped as freshmen in college. And so many people have a story of what happened to them at that age when they got off and got independent, but they didn't have any way to protect themselves, and they were dissociative and all sorts of things. So anyway, I said that he took me out to the river, and that and started groping me, and I was like, I don't want you to do that, and I need you to take me home right now. And he did. Really?
And so that was your memory.
That was my memory, right? That I remembered all the way to that point. And so that was just a kind of, that's a great example of how I did that, that I would remember the memory. And my therapist, we often said that I kept clues for myself, that when the time came for me to heal, I had boxes that I would go in and find clues because I would be in therapy and I said, I have something in a box. She was fascinated. What do you have in the box this time?
Oh my gosh, that's crazy. You know what? Look, I'm going to do it. And I normally don't do this, but see that box?
Yes.
That's my box of clues.
Is it? Oh my
Yes. God. It's filled with notes and letters. I've never heard anybody else talk about it before, but that's my box. Like it has.
Yes. And so I had within my dissociative system, which it's always a system, and it's all created to protect yourself. I had a little girl who had carried a box to a basement, and she she was molested. And so that box, she put the memory in the box, and then that became part of my system. She was a little girl in my system who took all the memories and put them in boxes. And she was the one, like she collected the clues. So yeah, so that story is really in my 2 books of how I had to help her realize that didn't need to be her job anymore, but we kept going back and finding boxes. And so, so not only did I actually carry a box with me, but I had boxes that I carried physically with me.
Right.
Since I was a child. And so, and some of it, once I processed the whole memory, I was able to say, I can let you go now. Thank you for helping me.
Yeah.
Right? You brought me joy. You helped me to the memory. And
yeah.
And so, we had boxes. That's awesome.
That's crazy awesome. Right. And you know what it's all about is resilience and the power of resilience. And I think, at least in my opinion, is that the way you coped was surely a sign that you were an extremely resilient, child. And then, along your whole journey.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's important to realize that a child can be resilient and not healed.
Yes.
And so one of my chapters in my second book, which is Jeannie's Brave Childhood. And that's just completely my story of, I'm connected with the Attachment and Trauma Network. And I've spoken at 2 of their conferences, and I blog for them. And one of the things that I do is to help them understand the behaviors of children. So my degrees were heavy in child development and educational psychology and so forth. And so I had this background to really take what I learned from my story. So one of my chapters in the second book is when survival looks like resilience. And so we were surviving by using dissociative coping mechanisms, and yes, it's resilience, but it doesn't mean that it healed.
Right. No. Right.
Right. And so that's one of the points that I'm working on my third book now. And one of the points I'm trying to make, it's about my adult life. And I want to say that just because you're surviving doesn't mean that that's how it's supposed to be.
Right.
And that healing can take it from surviving to where you're actually thriving. But resilience is what gets us through.
Yes.
And I think that the research tells us that resilience is really because you had one person who, there was one person who believed in you, and that would have been my dad, and my brother. But, my dad, I dedicate the second book to him, and because his belief in me and who I was, and I was the third child, and I was the little girl, and he loved me. And I start out brave with the story of how he would tell me, Jeannie, you can be brave. I need you to be brave. And so that really, there's a lot that goes around about being brave, but it comes out of my story because of my dad telling me that he needed me to be brave. And asking me really sometimes to take on an adult role to take care of my mother, which I should not have had to take on.
Right.
But, it's what it is. So he had hard choices to make, very, very difficult choices. So.
Yeah, I get it. We talked about it a little bit before recording. Yeah, when you get into those codependent roles of caring for your parent as a child. Yeah.
As a child. It was really interesting because when I have a friend who is a child therapist, and she read Brave. She's one of the endorsers for this and for the book, and she stopped me as she's giving comments. She said, your dad asked you to be brave, but that was not something that a little child should have had to do. And I'm like, you're right. And so I added, there's a statement in that Brave story of the stairway, him teaching me how to go up and down stairs. But then later he asked me to be brave when I was in the emergency room. And because my mother, I was my mother's trigger. And many times when we talk about parenting with PTSD, many times our own children can become our triggers. And so one of my missions is to help women heal before we repeat the generational patterns. And so anyway, but he asked me to be brave that day. And I was the little girl who had been abused, and I was in the emergency room, and I was the one being asked to be brave.
Oh.
I took care of my mother, right? That's a tragic part of the story. So, so that where we have to take on the roles that the adults, because the adults are incapable of doing that. And that's hard.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. I've talked before about, when you were talking about resilience, and thank God I had my grandma Kitty in my life, and she was always there and present. And so she was that, who I say was my saving grace, if you will. Yeah. And I had my dad was physically abusive, and my mom was an addict. And so, so trying to make my way through, and thank you, Grandma Kitty, for being there. So wonderful.
Yes,
yeah.
That person. I wrote a piece in one of my friends' books. And I talk about the church as being part of my support group, even though it was a two-sided thing, because a lot of my abuse occurred by people who were in the church, men who were in the church. And so that was a dark side of it, but the bright side of it were all the wonderful people who thought I was amazing, right? And they loved me, and they took care of me, and they, but it's those people in our lives that enable us to be resilient.
Yes, absolutely. And it's that, and it can be, a teacher. It can be, a coach. It can be just that person. It's almost like that unconditional support and love that, because I just, I know my Grandma Kitty never yelled at me. She hugged me and loved me. And she just was there for me in such a sweet and gentle way, which was what my chaotic little life needed. So, yeah.
And I think, and you say teachers, which is really funny that I didn't bring that part up, is that I trained teachers for the classroom. I taught intro to education, and teachers were such an important part of my story. I talk about that throughout both of my books, and I every year when I taught intro to education, when the new group would come in, I would ask them, talk about a teacher that made a difference. And one year I was horrified because one student, she said, I never had a teacher that did that. I'm like, and you want to be a teacher?
Right.
Why would you want to be a teacher if no teacher ever did that for you? Because they all had a story.
Right. Unless she was saying, I want to be the one to do that, because nobody ever did.
That's exactly what she said to me. She said, because it wasn't fair that nobody was there for me. And I want to be that teacher for someone. And it was, and she is. She's a wonderful teacher now, and she's my friend on Facebook. And so I'd see she's won awards, and and I'm like, yes, that is exactly what you did. You turned
Good for her.
Yeah. So, that's an interesting part of my story, because I taught classroom management. I taught, and I never mentioned trauma. And I would feel bad about that, except nobody else mentioned trauma either.
Right.
It wasn't just me. It was not on our radar. We were all like, well, bad things happen to kids. We know the kids that probably have had some bad things happen, but we didn't realize it was literally changing their brain structure.
Right.
That it literally embedded in their bodies, and that they were being triggered in the classroom, and that's what some of their outrageous reactions were. And so when I finally, I'm in therapy, I didn't start out wanting to be brave. I was absolutely terrified. For a year, I didn't even tell anyone I was in therapy. I was like, no, I'm a professor in a college, a Christian college, and I have it all together. I don't want anyone to know I'm in therapy. And so I was just absolutely terrified. But when I got past that, and I realized that my story could help people.
Yeah.
And that if I could just be brave, and I remember the day, it was a really rough therapy day. You've had those, haven't you? Where you just, today was rough. This was a really rough one. And I was just sitting on the couch trying to gather myself together and get out the door, which, my therapist, she always had to figure out if there was an adult available to drive home, because children would show up in therapy, and she couldn't let me out the door until there was an adult that could drive. And so anyway, I said to her, if I can help one person, if I could just help one person to not go through what I've gone through over the past few months in working, if I could help one child, if I could help people to help children, if I could help one person to go to therapy before they're just such a mess like I was.
Right.
Oh my goodness, if I could just encourage them to get help sooner. I mean, I was 61. Nobody should do that at 61.
Right.
That's bad.
I was in my 40s, and I say EMDR was one of the toughest things I've ever done. And yes, it does require bravery, because I had to go back into those dark spaces, but I looked forward to going to sessions, because I knew we were going to uncover something, or I was going to discover, and because I always left exhausted, emotionally drained, but empowered.
Empowered. Yeah.
You know?
And the epiphanies that you have in
Yes.
of this was not my fault.
Yes.
I did not, I had, so my first abuse was in a daycare. I was 3 years old. And was in a home daycare situation. And this man, I was groomed. Like when I was in EMDR, I could see how I was being groomed and how I had no defenses. And I had attachment issues because my mother and I never attached, and I needed attention and she couldn't give it to me. And so I could, in EMDR, you can see all of that. You can see the whole landscape of what happened. He asked me, and I don't even know if I have this in the book. He asked me, do you want to go out and play with the children, or do you want to stay in here and I'll play blocks with you? And I said, oh, I'll stay in here and play blocks with you. And so for my entire life, from the time I was 3, I thought that playing blocks with him was the reason I was abused, that I made a choice. And so I had chosen to be abused. And so, and how do you get to that without a EMDR?
Right.
I don't know how. I mean, because that was such a freeing moment for me when I realized, because choices, from the very first day of therapy, I was like, no, I don't have choices. I don't, we struggled with the issue of choices, through 3 years of therapy. And I, even now I uncover things like, oh, that has to do with choices. That has to do. And so, yeah.
You have my brain reeling right now. Like, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. Like, I'm scanning. You probably see my eyes going back and forth, just like in EMDR, because I'm like scanning, like, yeah,
yes,
that's powerful.
And that's really what I do in Brene. I am willing to say all of those things in order for people. And so one of my former students wrote me and goes, you wrote a people mover. You're moving people to therapy is what you're doing, because they realize that there's hope, that they can go and uncover this thing that they've never understood about themselves, that they've never been able to break free of the patterns they keep repeating, and that they can go and get help and they can stop having to suffer in that way.
Right.
And, to me, that's just so, I did that. Right. I just don't even, I remember the day I signed the contract, which I was contacted. I was in a group, and it was, and a friend of ours published a book, and I'm just going to say it was Tom Howard, and the book, his first book, but he's written a book, God Can't. And it's all about our view of God and in our abuse and suffering. It's a tremendous book. So I'm just going to give him a plug right out there.
All right. Plug away.
But, and he talks about Brave in the middle of it. He has like a 2 where he talks about Brave. So I owe him that, right?
That's right.
But it was a very transforming, like, turn my world upside down. Oh, you mean God didn't want me to be abused? And no, God never wants a child to be abused. No, never, ever. And so, anyway, I know, oh, I've done it. I've lost my train of thought.
It's all good. I do it all the time on this podcast. People are my audience is used to it by now. They're like, I call it menopause brain, and mine just goes, woo, okay, it's gone.
I mean, and when it does that, I've given up trying to trace it.
I'd so help you out, but
you followed me down the path.
I did.
You're going to be like, oh, that's what she said. It'll come back. I don't know. So, yeah. So it's gone. It is absolutely completely.
I'll ask another question, and then maybe if it comes back.
I want to say something to that, though, because before my healing journey, I would be drowning in shame right now. I would be like, oh, why on earth did you do an interview? That is just, oh my, look at what you did. I would be beating, my self-critic would be beating. And now I'm like, oh, well, it'll come.
See, and that's the beauty of the healing. And I love that you brought that up, because yeah, it's just, you just, I don't know, just learn to be compassionate with yourself. And but my therapist called it being gentle with myself. And when I learned to be gentle with myself, wow, what a powerful gift that was.
It's huge.
Yeah.
I remember I did so many interesting things as I was healing, but I went to a conference, an attached conference, which is for therapists. You can attend them, but it's really for therapists. And so I tend to, I'm so curious. I mean, and Brene Brown talks about curiosity being one of the cornerstones of healing, that you have to be curious about, why do I feel like that?
Yeah.
What's the problem? So anyway, I went to this attached, and I saw presenters make mistakes, and they were all therapists, and they were like, well, lost that. And they just moved on. And I'm like, they know how not to beat themselves up.
Yeah.
I mean, they do this every day. They help people to not drown in shame over just little human mistakes, right?
Right.
It was this wonderful day of just watching every single one of them make a mistake and not beat themselves up about it and just move on. And so that's kind of where I learned to do that, like I did today. I still don't remember what I was talking about.
It's all good. Maybe at the end you'll be like, wait, I've got it.
I'm going to stop you if I come to it.
All right. No, do.
And we can move on to something else.
All right. So another question I have is, are there any facts or myths that you want to clarify that you've learned along your own healing journey?
There's so many, but I wrote one on my sheet when I was trying to think about how I would answer that particular question. And I think dissociative disorders are so the media portrays them in such awful ways. I had about 21 or more personalities, and they were all, and if you study internal family systems, they say we all have roles, and we all have, and Richard Schwartz in a video, he says, really dissociation is an exaggeration. It's a complete, like, push it over the edge of what we normally do. And so the abuse and the continued abuse makes us continue to compartmentalize and put in boxes. But each of my little children who were created as a result of trauma, they all had a very distinct personality, and you meet them in my books. And I love them. When I write, I just feel them all gather in around me, and we just take off and we write, and they bring me great joy now in their healed selves. And in the second book, I talk about what their life was like before healing and who they are now as a result of healing. And so now we just cooperate, and I don't shift, and I don't, all of that kind of stuff. But the media portrays that, which is a natural coping mechanism, as a, well, we call it a disorder. We say
Right.
dissociative disorders. No,
Right.
it's like the most amazing thing. And most people who are dissociative are intelligent, brilliant people. They were smart little kids, and their subconscious was just working overtime to figure out, how do I survive this? How do I get up? And I talk about in the second book that no child, somewhere, Peter Levine is probably doing the best job of helping people understand how to help children after trauma. But to just have a traumatic experience, most children are just required to get up and keep living.
Right.
Okay, time to go to school, time to go to practice, time to, and so the child has to figure out how to survive that.
Right.
Compartmentalizing, and and so dissociation is really on a spectrum that goes all the way from I drove my car home and I don't remember how I got here, right? All the way to I just shifted and I'm no longer who I was a minute ago.
Right.
And,
Right.
and my
Because
therapist,
I know I didn't have, at least that I'm aware of, and it never came up in EMDR, other personas that were created to cope. Mine was to the compartmentalizing part of it,
right.
and the hovering, like being away from, and I did have a hover experience. I have a horrific fear of bridges. I can't drive over them. There's a select few that I can make it over, but like if I get stuck on an overpass, I'll have heightened anxiety. I used to have horrific panic attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Do what?
Me and mountain roads right there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so there's just, there was just a trigger. Well, then when we went back in one of my sessions when I was 4, my mom in an intoxicated state attempted to drown me and my 1-year-old sister in a bathtub and held our heads underwater. My dad came in and saved the day. But during that session, I was floating above our house and like looking down into the whole scene. And we lived in northern Kentucky. I live in Cincinnati. And the I-75 bridge that connected northern Kentucky to Cincinnati was just below our hill. Like you could look down over it, over the Ohio River. And I started floating over that bridge. And so again, we made a correlation between bridges and my dissociative state during that particular trauma incident. And it was very fascinating to me.
Absolutely fascinating. One of my triggers was Brussels sprouts.
Wow.
Right? I'm not giving it away. You'll have to read.
Is it in Brave?
Wait, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
And some of the triggers, they don't make, and so when I hear somebody say, oh, I've never been able to do that, or that just da-da-da-da, you're like, it's connected to something, right? And,
yes.
And children are always connecting. So before we moved, and we talked earlier about my recent move, which delayed this interview.
Right.
Yes. We were by a construction site, and my dog, one day they came, and they'd never done this before, but a huge truck with these massive boulders came and dumped right next to where we were. Just boom. And so he connected the beep beep of the truck backing up
with
to
the boom,
ground shaking and so, we had to work with him for months to get him over that. So that's how we connect stuff together.
Yeah.
It can be completely unrelated, right?
Right.
And we connect those pieces together, and when they get hooked up with trauma and dissociation, and we can't even find it. And that's the beauty of EMDR, isn't it?
Yes. Oh, again, things that would come up that I had totally, I don't want to say forgotten, because it was certainly in there, but I had stored so far away. But man, when it came back, it came flooding, and I just knew it as truth. And it was just amazing.
I think that's a really important point to make, is that because people say, well, how did you know it was true that you didn't? I knew.
Yes.
There was no, sometimes I would leave and I'd be like, did I? And then I remember the physical
yes,
that was happening in EMDR, and I'm like, oh no, somebody does not make that up.
No,
right?
No.
And so, I never doubted. It's really interesting because no one, not my family, no one knew the story that I told in Brave. Ever. No one. I had created this person who walked around in the world and had never had an idyllic childhood, a mother who was, had issues, but just not to the extreme that she did. And so when I get ready to sign my contract with the publisher, I'm getting ready to tell the entire world this story. And would they believe me? it was a really terrifying moment.
Yes, I'm right there. I'm in the middle of finishing a book, and and I'm like, my story's so crazy. Like, even Hollywood's going to be like, wow. But it's just,
you're going to be like, and here's the really odd thing is that my former students have been some of my best supporters. I mean, I taught college, and I cared about them, and they would come to my office and they would start talking, and I would say something. They'd say, "How do you understand this?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I just do. I just understand." So I have not had one single, maybe they're just kind and they're not saying it, but I've never had a person not believe me.
Right. Hey, did you notice that you came back around because the point that you lost it? You had said about signing the contract.
So I came back
You came back around?
Special talent. That's right. Because I don't think at the time, so this person that I was in the group with, she was a publisher, and she contacted me, and I said, I'm not sure it's the book you want to publish. I went to her website and I was like, I'm not sure. She goes, well, will you send me the manuscript and let me decide? I did everything not to publish, right?
Right.
And so I sent it to her on a Thursday, and she offered me a contract on Monday.
Wow.
And I actually include a poem that she wrote in the second book. After she finished Brave, she wrote a poem, and I include it in the second book. And so Kathy Lawton, Kledak Publishers, and they've been my support group. They've been wonderful.
Wonderful.
So,
Sammy's saying hi. Hi, Sam.
He's hearing stuff going on outside.
That's right. She's like, there's some activity happening. I know normally the dogs are very well behaved, but we have spring break teenagers hanging out at the house, so something must be happening.
Look at you. So
yeah, she's cute, baby.
Yeah, so that was the end of that contract thing.
All right.
Sent out a single proposal, and I don't know that I could have.
Right.
Rejection, just typical rejection from publishers, was too tied to my healing at that point.
Yes.
So I feel like God just said, no, Jeanne, you can't do that. Let's just publish it and see where it goes. And so I had someone write me last week from my website, and anyone can go to my website and contact me through there. And she sent me an email, and she said that she was in therapy, and that her therapist, who I do not know, in some state that I'm not even connected with, had told her that she should read my books.
Oh,
and so
how cool is that?
Yes. And so there's some really, every once in a while, I get just a glimmer, just this little, oh my goodness, it's out there, and it's helping.
Yes.
And it's changing. I have people write me and say, I made an appointment with a therapist because I read your book, and I think that there's hope for me to heal. And so, that's just been, oh my goodness, such an incredible part of this journey. And that day that I sat on the couch, if I could just help one person, my vision was this big.
Yes. Oh, I get it. Yes. And you said if I could just, give someone hope to heal, because I write a monthly newsletter, and it's called Hope for Healing. And yeah, that's my whole point, is to offer, if any, in this podcast, I told you beforehand, shine your light of hope, because that's what's so desperately needed for people who have been through trauma. I know at the beginning of your book, you talk about, the statistics of, if you put 100 people in the room, chances are, 20 to 25 of them, women. It's 1 out of 4, right?
Yes.
And 1 out of 7 for males. And
which I think is actually not realistic, because they don't report.
Exactly. Which is just terrifying and horrible.
Yes.
I mean, who's doing this? Like, I just stop.
I know. And the thing, it's all healing. I mean, I had to come to terms with why was it, what was in the mind of my perpetrators,
Right.
when they decided that doing this to a 3-year-old child was something they should get up, that they should do that day.
Right.
And it wasn't just, I mean, it uncovered in layer after layer after layer. You know, I didn't get to the whole, you can't handle getting to the whole thing at once. And I think that therapists who do EMDR, I mean, they need to be cautious about that and really have skill and supervision.
Right.
They need to go through, because if you open up too much too quickly, it will drown the client. And so the skill of my therapist to contain that afterwards. And I've heard some stories where it wasn't contained, where you didn't get back in a box and you send the person out, and it's,
we always put mine in we put it in its little safe box, and
it needs to go back in. It needs to be contained. You need to be, and so anyway, the hope, I sign my books like that. I lost my train of thought again right there. Okay.
This is why I love our conversation.
You'll be like, oh, you came back to it.
Yeah, we'll come back around. It's all good.
But I sign my books a lot. Hope for Healing.
Oh, that makes my heart happy.
I know. So that's why, because I connected with you off of ACEs.
Yeah.
Connection, right?
Yeah.
And I looked you up. I checked you out. And I was like, oh, this is something that goes along with, what I'm trying to do. Right?
Yes.
Healing. And so I think my books, I was so careful. In telling my story, I understand that some people will be triggered. I understand that. I'd say that right up front.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I know I saw a trigger warning, and you said, and I loved the way you said it, because it was just real, was get help. Like, seek therapy or counseling. I don't remember the exact wording that you used, but
I wrote it and I don't remember.
Right. That's editing. They'll change things up. I
go back and read Brave again. I'm like, well, that was good.
All right.
Yes, because our society has generally shied away from feeling uncomfortable. Okay, and so I know that my openness. Well, sometimes people look at me and they said, "You did this," and my generation doesn't talk. I mean, they generally. Right. I mean, lots of my friends have come to me and said, and this happened to me too, but I'm never writing Brave. I just want to tell you that. And I'm like, well, I wrote Brave.
Right. Right.
And so, but it's so that talking about it, this is the only way that these generational patterns end, is for us to be open, for us to talk about it, and to the silence is killing us, and it's enabling, our silence enables the perpetrators.
Correct.
They're not held accountable, and we've seen that in how many church scandals now. Right. Because they were seen as set apart, and they got by with it. And I think it's important that in my story, and I never name anyone, because that, to me, I could have, but to me that would have distracted from my purpose. I'm not saying that no one should. I'm just saying, for my choice was not to. And so, and if I felt like that anyone was still in danger, then I would have named. Right. Okay.
Yeah, I gotcha. I don't name in mine either, but like you, the way I've set mine up is I tell a trauma story in a chapter, like at the beginning. Don't name names, but I don't want the trauma to be the focus. I want the hope to be the focus.
Right.
So then I move on to a lesson learned within that, like empowerment or bravery or strength, something a gift that I found within that chaos. And then I give exercises that I utilized along my healing journey, from yoga to meditation, and I talk about those kinds of things, and I offer those to the readers. So, but yeah, it's not about, I don't want, by naming them, it almost gives them
power.
Yeah, power, exactly. And so by leaving them these nameless entities that I just talk about as part of my story, but then again, I move on to that happened. There's nothing I can do to undo it, but here's how I healed it, and here's what I learned from it. And yeah.
And a big part of mine, and that's what my mission statement is I take that and I talk about, this is how attachment played into this, and this is how the trauma got embedded, which the body keeps the score by Bessel Van Der Kolk. I mean, that was a huge part of my healing journey, because I saw, all of these things. And in fact, 2 years ago, my daughter and I, and our story is another part of healing. And so when you find out your mom, by the way, there were 3 of me that raised you. I mean, that's
right. Right.
So anyway, but we did a conference at the Attachment and Trauma Conference 2 years ago, and we talked about trauma-sensitive math, because we're both math educators. And I realized along the way all of the ways that my learning had been affected. I'm a terrific compensator, and I actually became a math teacher for, basic college level stuff. Not even basic college level, kind of a overview topical approach to math, which I did as a teacher educator too. So I never want anybody to think I'm a mathematician. Please don't. But I love math, and she does too. And she's a elementary assistant principal up here in Washington. And so we went together and did this. It was a great part. We went to Washington, D.C. together and spoke, and we talked about ways that math can be taught to help these kids that their brains have been affected by trauma. So that's kind of a whole nother piece of what I do, is the education side of it.
Yeah.
And I may have an opportunity to talk to future therapists in training, which I don't want to say much about it, but I'm like, oh, that's
exciting. Yeah. Very cool. So I have one last final question for you. I can't believe we've gone an hour.
Oh my goodness.
Which is awesome. I don't want to stop, because there's about 50 other things I could talk to you about, but I have to ask you my favorite question, which is, if you could meet anyone in the world, dead or alive, to help you along your continued journey, who would it be?
Okay, so that was so funny, because when I saw that, I'm like, I don't know who wants to answer that question, because I can come up. So I'm scrolling right now on my iPad, because I don't want to leave one, because I couldn't decide on one, right?
All right. That's good.
I can't. So I've already mentioned Bessel Van Der Kolk.
Yes.
And so for the purpose of learning, I just want to sit down and share my story, and that would be everything to me, to have a conversation with him and to talk to him about how the body keeps the score helped me on my journey. That would be a dream come true.
I talk about that book when I give my presentations, because it is very powerful. Yes.
Yeah. Wouldn't you love to sit down and have a conversation with him?
Yeah.
So then, okay, I am not at the right place. So then if I wanted to talk to people that are also spreading hope and spreading understanding, and would take Brave and get it out there to more people, so more people can heal. It's not about selling books. I don't make that much when I sell them, right?
Right.
It's not about that. It's about the hope, right? Well, then it would have to be Oprah, Ellen, and Brene Brown, right? You know, if I can sit down and have a conversation with them, right, and tell them, share how excited I am about all the healing that's taking place because of my book. I just,
oh my gosh. Yeah. When Oprah did that.
Slide, right? Oh, there's
Yeah.
one more because, are you familiar with Dr. Bruce Perry?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. When Oprah did that interview on CBS 60 Minutes with Dr. Bruce Perry and talked about ACEs, I was literally like, whoa, because, I had just discovered, I had been a part of the ACEs Connection community and discovered, adverse childhood experiences, and her talking about it just brought it to the forefront of the mental health scene.
It did. I when I found out, in fact, I was up here in Washington at my brother-in-law and sister-in-law's, and I was like, we have to watch this. Everyone's sitting down, we're going to watch this, And so, because it brought it into mainstream. And that's what Oprah's interview did, brought it into mainstream. And that was when I got introduced, really, to Bruce Perry. Okay, and have you read his book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog?
I have not read it.
Oh, okay. So amazing. And one of the things he says at the end, which I want to say, which is what I would love to have a conversation with him about, is he does the same thing. Why are we in such a mess? Why do we have so many hurting kids? Why are our schools filled with these behaviors? And one of the things that he says is that we've lost the extended family structure. And I think, like you talking about how your grandmother was there for you when your parents could not be, okay? But we've moved away and we've broken up that extended family, and we're not. And so now that was part of our plan eventually, was to move here because we share a house with my daughter and her 2 children, our grandchildren. And that was one of the reasons that we did that. And so when I read that in his book, I'm like, oh, I want to sit down and talk to him about that, because I really do believe that that's playing a part, is that we've lost those intergenerational connections. And they're so important when a parent can't do it, that there's someone else there that can.
Right.
Yeah, so there's my whole list.
All right. That's a great list, right? Or just bring them all together and have like this great powwow.
Could we? If I had a survivor's dream, somebody fulfilled the dreams of survivors, right?
Yes. Oh, right.
It would be like, we'll meet at a coffee house and we'll all sit around the table with them.
That would be awesome. Can I come too?
Oh yes, I'll have you come.
Yes. I'll just sit and be very quiet and
Oh no, I don't think that's possible.
I know, I don't think it's possible either.
No.
Oh, well, this has been absolutely delightful. And again, I could talk to you probably for another 4 hours on air, and still cover a lot of stuff. But
I know I'm going to often say, I should have said this, and I should have said this, and I shouldn't. But I could just say, I say it everything the way I want to say it in my book. So please read it. I can't guarantee I said it right today, but I can guarantee that I said it the way I wanted to in my book.
So everybody go get the book. I'll have it on here on video. So how do people get a hold of you? How do people get a hold of the book?
So my website is Janyne.org, JANYNE.org. And if you go there on the contact page, and I respond. People are like, oh, you responded to me. Well, yeah, I respond.
Yeah, I respond. Yeah.
So that's the best way to get in. And also I'm on Amazon. I have an author page, so you can follow me. And I'm on Facebook, and I'm on Twitter. Not real good with Twitter yet.
Me either.
I'm trying.
Right.
Yeah, it's just like a learning curve. Instagram, I have an Instagram account. I do nothing with it. I think it has one picture.
See, and I do Instagram more than Twitter, because my middle child, he makes fun of me, with my twittering. I don't even know.
Yes. So all of those really are, I have an author page on, and pretty much if people friend me and I realize that they've read Brave, I friend them,
Yeah.
So, yeah. Yeah, because I just want them, because I teach all the time. I can't help it. So
Right. I gotcha.
yeah.
So is there anything else you want to address before we part ways?
I think I want to say to those who believe that if they ever told their story, they would be completely rejected. It's a terrifying thing, because your perpetrators tell you you have so many embedded internalized messages. And I believe that. I believe that I was, in fact, I had someone monitoring my email on my website because I thought people would say awful things to me. Why did I think that?
Right.
That's all part of the trauma, that you believe that. And so I want to say to anyone that's afraid to tell their story, I didn't begin by writing Brave. I found one friend that I told. I found a therapist. I found my husband, who was very supportive, has been supportive. I find one person you can trust and tell them your story and start to break free from the silence.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
Yes.
And I've found, and my audience knows, but when I started finally putting my story out there, and it was on Facebook, to all of my friends and family, I was overwhelmed with the amount of people who either texted me or called me or messaged me privately, like private messenger, to say, oh my gosh, me too, or thank you so much for putting your story out there. And now the responses that I get, are, I've only had one person that I ever had to unfriend because of the very nasty comments that were made. And it wasn't, I sent her a message saying, I respect your opinion, but, and then it just got nastier. And so I just, for my own self-protection, just ended that.
My world, and I can do what I want. That's
exactly.
Really
yeah, no, this is my story. And if my truth makes you uncomfortable, that's not my fault.
Right.
That's something she's going to have to deal with. But, yeah, so no, but the response has been incredibly overwhelming and supportive, and how many people you do help by sharing your story.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. You can't know that on that other side of
right.
You can't, people can tell it to you. Well, you don't know my family, or you don't know my brother, you don't.
Yes, right.
2 years have been an absolute wonderful support for me, even though I told the story of our mother, right?
Yeah.
And I actually dedicate Brave to my mother for the person that she was never able to be.
Oh.
And so that's all part of the story. It's like bookends. The dedication and the epilogue are kind of tied together. And so I feel like she's cheering in heaven because I'm helping people where she could never receive help. And so, yeah.
That's beautiful. Well, I thank you for being brave. I thank you for sharing your story, shining your light of hope. Yes, and helping others along their healing journey. I like to think of it as those of us who have been through the darkness or returned back into the darkness, I guess, and have come into the light, is reaching our hands out to others who are still,
and
struggling.
Don't know that there's so much goodness on the
right.
other side.
Exactly. So thank you for extending that hand of hope.
I appreciate you having me on this interview so that I could spread the word.
Absolutely. My honor, or my joy. So yes. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us on the Healing Place podcast. And until next time, remember, be gentle with yourselves. Thanks. Bye-bye.